Hi, I'm Ginger Mord, and I work for the Washington, D.C. city government. Here's my poster. I wanted to see if people in Washington, D.C., if once they have children, if they tend to move out of the city more than other residents in the city. And this kind of summarizes my findings. I found that once people in D.C. have their first child, they do tend to leave the city at higher rates than the population as a whole. And I work for the DC tax office, so how I did this was I used individual income tax data to track people over time. This orange line here shows DC residents that were in the city in 2006 and 7, and then had their first child in 2007. And then I tracked them in subsequent years to see what percent of them stayed in the city. And then the blue line shows all DC residents who were in the city in 2006 and 7, and what percent of them stayed in the following years. So I looked 5 years later and saw that 52% of the folks who had their first child were still in the city, whereas 60% of everyone who started out here in the same time period were still in the city 5 years later. I also went to see if the new parents, if their move rates varied with income. And so that's what this graph shows. So I looked at this cohort of people who had their first child, and then I divided them by income into income deciles. And I looked to see if 5 years later they were still in the city. So what we see here is that the people in the lower incomes and in the higher incomes tended to stay in the city more than people in the middle incomes. And for anyone who lives in Washington, D.C., that might be a pretty intuitive finding. The higher income people can probably afford a nicer house, perhaps in a neighborhood with better schools, or might be able to afford private schools. And people in the lower incomes are perhaps less mobile, and they also might benefit from some of the social programs in the city. I also went to see if the rates of people staying have changed over time. Lots of times, we hear in the media that cities have all sorts of new amenities that are attracting young professionals, and people are betting that they're going to stay in the city once they have kids. So I went to see if that was true. What I found was that the rates of new parents staying in the city really haven't changed much between 2002 and 2011, which is the time period for which I had data. When I looked at 2007 to 2011, which is a period I had the best data for, I really saw that the percentage of people staying in the city who just had a child really stayed the same over that whole time. I was also able to look back to 2002 with a slightly different set of data. I was only looking at married people who went from 0 to 1 dependents, and I think 70 to 80% of these folks actually had their first child. And I looked at 5 years later, were they still in the city after they had their child? So these are folks who had their first child in 2002. 56% of them were left 5 years later. Sorry, these are adding their first dependent. These are folks who in 2003 added their first dependent. 54% of them were left 5 years later. And then I looked all the way to people adding their first dependent in 2007. And really I found that the rates of them staying in the city were pretty stable over time. So those were my main findings, and I'm putting out a policy brief in a few months with more details. And you can reach me at ginger.mored, that's MOORED, at dc.gov.